Quilty is brought to you by APQS, handcrafted quilting machines. Aurifil Italian thread, perfectly suited for all your quilting projects. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Clothworks, inspiring creativity with art on fabric. Hovels Sewing, when you need to cut it close, choose Hovels. B&B, our fabrics, your lifestyle. Quiltology, the urban quilt space.
Quilty.
Making patchwork means sewing smaller units into bigger units, and short seams are always easier to sew than long ones. So we're going to apply that concept to sashing today on Quilty. Join us. Hi, so the quilt behind me, it's actually just a quilt top so far. It's not been quilted. It's still in the process of being made, but this is a quilt that I have made, I've begun. It's a Quilt of Valor quilt. Quilts of Valor is a really wonderful organization that gives quilts to wounded service people. You should learn more about Quilts of Valor, and we'll talk more about them one day on an episode. But I wanted to make a Quilt of Valor for a wounded service person, and I found this really amazing repeating crosses block that I just loved. But what I did is I ended up changing it a little bit. So we're going to talk about these sashing pieces, these blue strips that are inside the quilt top. And I'm going to tell you a little trick for doing sashing that really helps if you want to try that yourself. So first, I'm going to show you, I'm going to bring in the pattern that I used here. I just love these crosses. For this Quilts of Valor quilt, I thought it was especially appropriate to use these crosses. It sort of seemed to me like a Medal of Honor. There was something about the block that I really loved. It seemed very like it was valorific, if that makes sense. There was lots of valor to this design. And I had this awesome red and gold fabric that seemed like medieval knight or something. So it just really struck me. So I loved this pattern. It was really great. Using it to make my cross block was excellent, very easy instructions. But when I was laying out my blocks, and let me show you, I had these blocks and I started to put them up on my design wall. And I had this beige color and that red and the white, the gold and the red. I just loved it. It's actually an African print. There was something about it I just loved. And it's not a traditional just red, white, and blue Quilt of Valor quilt, as you can see, but I'm just like that. I like to switch things up a little bit. But as I was putting them out and laying them up on the design wall, they just needed something else. And I could have just had a blue border maybe on the quilt or even a blue back to have the red, white, and blue, but it was missing something. And I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put a border in between. I'm going to put some sashing in between these blocks. And sashing is really just that. It's an inner border. And so I found a blue that I loved, and this blue actually has a little bit of the beige kind of in those polka dots. And when I auditioned some different blues for these sashing pieces, and I found that I loved this one most of all. And so I decided it was perfect, and I was going to add some blue sashing pieces to my quilt. Okay, let's take another look at the quilt behind me, and I'll tell you the trick for pre-sashing. Something called pre-sashing. That's the point of today's lesson, right? So once you have all your blocks up here and you decide you want to do sashing, you could do it one of two ways. You could join these long rows together and then cut a long strip of sashing and join it together that way. You could do that. Or say if your sashing was here, if you were doing a row of sashing here, which I'm not, but if you did, you could join all these rows together and then do a long row of sashing, join that row. But a long seam is hard to sew. It's harder than a short seam. Short seams are what you really want to do, if at all possible, because it's just more accurate. When you have a really long row, which you do when you're finally putting your quilt top, when it's really coming together and you're joining your big rows, it's easy to get off. It's harder to make sure your pinning is perfect. The weight, there's like a drag as you're sewing along on a long row. The quilt can kind of drag because it gets heavy. All that fabric off to your left is kind of getting heavy, and it can really mess up your accuracy. So a shorter seam is better. So what you can do is pre-sash your blocks. This is what I mean. If you cut smaller pieces of sashing, and my block finishes 12 inches, so I cut 12-inch strips, and I think they're are they 2.5? Yeah, I think they're 2.5 inch by 12 inches. And you cut shorter pieces and you join them to your blocks. That's a much shorter seam, and it's a lot easier to do than a long one. And then you would join another piece of sashing to another block, and then you start joining your pieces together, and all of a sudden most of your sashing's finished. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to do one of the pieces right now and show you what I mean. And a lot of quilts can be really punched up and made very sort of extra amazing with some sashing. I recommend it. And it really also made me feel like quite the designer, because I had found a pattern that I liked, but then I just wanted to do something a little bit different with it, and I just went for it, you know? Now, of course, if you add sashing, when you get to measuring your backing for your quilt, when you get to the fabric requirements that you need for binding and so forth, that's going to change, obviously, because you're changing the dimensions of your quilt. But a calculator and a little bit of time, and you'll have no problems figuring that out. All right, so I've just added a piece of sashing to my block. I'm going to take it over to my pressing surface. Move my book away. Open it up, and there you have already the sashing done on one of your blocks. Then you put it together there and join that row, and so forth and so on. But pre-sashing is so much easier than trying to do some really long skinny strip and trying to manage it. It's tough. Even if you're an advanced sewer, an advanced quilter, or you're just starting, it can be difficult to manage those long seams. The more you know about these little tricks, the more you can free yourself up to make design choices that really empower you and make your quilt even more beautiful. Join us on heyquilty.com, Facebook, Twitter. We'd love to see you there, and send us email too. Thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Quilty is brought to you by APQS, handcrafted quilting machines. Aurifil Italian thread, perfectly suited for all your quilting projects. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Clothworks, inspiring creativity with art on fabric. Hovels Sewing, when you need to cut it close, choose Hovels. B&B, our fabrics, your lifestyle. Quiltology, the urban quilt space.